The most radical act you can commit in this lifetime isn't rebellion against authority, revolution against systems, or even rejection of society's expectations. It's the quiet, almost imperceptible moment when you stop pretending to be interested in conversations that bore your soul to death. Not because you've become arrogant or antisocial, but because something deeper than social conditioning has awakened within you, something that Joseph Campbell recognized in every myth across every culture, the stirring of the authentic self that can no longer tolerate the performance of being someone you're not. You know this moment intimately, even if you've never named it. It happens during dinner parties, where everyone discusses the latest Netflix series with passionate intensity, while you find yourself wondering why nobody talks about what keeps them awake at 3 in the morning. It occurs in business meetings, where grown adults nod seriously about quarterly projections, while something inside you screams that life is finite and precious, and slipping away with every PowerPoint slide. You felt it standing in grocery store lines, watching people scroll through their phones with the desperate hunger of the spiritually malnourished, and realizing you're doing the exact same thing. This isn't cynicism speaking through you. It's the hero's journey beginning. Campbell understood that every mythic adventure starts not with a sword or a quest, but with a moment of recognition so profound it changes everything that comes after. The recognition that the life you've been living is not your life, that the conversations you've been having are not your conversations, that the person you've been being is not who you are beneath all the accumulated expectations and inherited dreams. The ordinary world, as Campbell called it, isn't just your hometown or your daily routine. It's the collective agreement to live unconsciously, to accept that shallow relationships are normal, that work you hate is inevitable, that dreams are for children and artists who don't understand reality. It's the world where asking, "What's the meaning of all this?" is met with nervous laughter and quick subject changes, where depth is considered depression and authenticity is labeled as being too intense. But something shifts when you can no longer participate in this collective sleepwalk. Maybe it happens gradually, like watching a movie you once loved and realizing you can see all the strings, all the manipulation, all the places where the story tries to make you feel things you no longer feel. Or maybe it arrives suddenly, like a lightning strike of clarity during an otherwise ordinary Tuesday afternoon, when you look around and see everyone moving like actors who've forgotten they're in a play. The mechanical nature of ordinary existence becomes impossible to ignore once you've glimpsed what lies beneath it. The same conversations cycling endlessly like a broken record player, the same emotional reactions triggered by the same predictable stimuli, the same fears driving the same decisions that lead to the same disappointments that generate the same conversations about how life is hard and unpredictable when it's actually the most predictable thing in the world once you see the patterns. Campbell mapped this territory across cultures and centuries because he understood that this awakening isn't personal, it's archetypal. Every hero in every story faces this same moment of recognition, that they've been living someone else's life, following someone else's map, pursuing someone else's definition of success while their own soul withers from neglect. This recognition brings its own form of loneliness, but it's not the loneliness of isolation. It's the sacred solitude of someone who has remembered what it feels like to be alive instead of simply functional. You begin to notice how rare authentic presence has become, how unusual it is to have a conversation that touches something real beneath the surface pleasantries, how isolated you feel when surrounded by people who seem content to discuss weather and weekend plans, while the world burns and dreams die and time passes like water through cupped hands. The distance you start to feel from the crowd isn't rejection, it's threshold crossing. Campbell knew that every hero must leave the village to find themselves, not because there's something wrong with the village, but because there's something essential about the journey that can only happen in solitude. The questions that begin arising within you, who am I really? What am I doing here? What would I do if I weren't afraid? These aren't questions that can be answered in committee or resolved through group consensus. The call to adventure that Campbell wrote about doesn't arrive as a messenger at your door or a magical owl tapping at your window. It manifests as an increasing inability to fake enthusiasm for things that leave your soul empty, a growing discomfort with the performance of being who others expect you to be, a persistent sense that you're capable of something more authentic than the life you've been living by default. This call whispers through moments when you catch yourself going through motions that feel increasingly hollow, nodding along with opinions you don't share, laughing at jokes that aren't funny, engaging in relationships where you perform connection instead of feeling it. The adventure Campbell mapped isn't about traveling to exotic locations or achieving extraordinary accomplishments. It's about the radical act of becoming who you actually are beneath all the layers of conditioning and compromise. When you begin responding to this call, solitude stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like initiation. The quiet hours that once terrified you with their emptiness begin revealing themselves as fullness you'd forgotten existed. You discover that being alone with yourself isn't something to escape, but something to embrace. Not because you're antisocial, but because you're finally becoming social with the most important person in your life, the authentic self that's been waiting patiently for you to remember it exists. This threshold crossing into conscious solitude is where the real work begins. Campbell understood that the wilderness where the hero must wander isn't necessarily a physical place. It's the psychological territory between who you were and who you're becoming. It's the uncomfortable space where you're too awake to participate in unconscious patterns, but not yet skilled at navigating conscious ones. The silence that once felt empty begins revealing layers of richness you never noticed when it was constantly filled with external noise and other people's opinions. You start having conversations with yourself that are more honest and interesting than most of the conversations you have with others. You begin to discover thoughts you actually think instead of thoughts you're supposed to think, feelings you actually feel instead of feelings that are socially acceptable. This isn't about becoming a hermit or rejecting human connection. It's about developing the capacity to be fully present with yourself so you can be fully present with others when authentic connection is actually possible. Campbell knew that the hero who returns from the journey doesn't come back bitter or isolated. They return with the ability to love more deeply because they've learned to love themselves. The loneliness that accompanies this awakening is different from the loneliness of being rejected or misunderstood. It's the sacred aloneness of someone who has stopped requiring others to validate their reality, who no longer needs external confirmation to know who they are or what they value. This doesn't make you cold or indifferent. It makes you free to connect from choice rather than need, from fullness rather than emptiness. The tests that Campbell identified in every heroic journey aren't dragons to slay or mountains to climb. They're the daily challenges of remaining conscious in a world that rewards unconsciousness, of speaking truthfully when lies would be easier, of maintaining your center when everyone around you is lost in their own dramas. Each time you choose presence over distraction, authenticity over performance, consciousness over automatic reaction, you're completing another stage of the journey Campbell mapped so carefully. But here's what makes this adventure worth taking. You begin to encounter others who've made similar journeys, people who recognize the light in your eyes because they've kindled their own. These meetings are rare and precious because they remind you that you're not crazy, not alone, not the only one who's discovered that there's more to existence than the mechanical repetition of unconscious patterns. If you've recognized yourself in these words, if you've felt the stirring of something deeper than your daily routine can contain, if you've experienced both the terror and liberation of waking up in a sleeping world, then you're already on the path. You're part of an invisible community of travelers, people across cultures and centuries who've heard the same call Campbell wrote about in every myth he studied. Consider this an invitation to join a conversation that goes deeper than the surface, to explore questions that matter more than answers. Subscribe not just to receive more videos, but to join a circle of fellow travelers who understand that the most important journey isn't to anywhere else but to who you really are. Share your own moment of awakening in the comments. When did you first realize you were living mechanically? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to answer their own call. The trials Campbell wrote about aren't the obvious battles against external monsters. They're the subtle daily confrontations with the parts of yourself that would rather sleep than wake up, rather perform than be real, rather conform than stand alone in truth. The real dragon isn't guarding some treasure in a distant cave. It's the voice in your head that whispers, "You're being too intense, too different, too much for a world that prefers its people dimmed and manageable." In the mythology of consciousness, the approach to the innermost cave is that moment when you realize how deep the programming runs, how thoroughly you've been conditioned to live someone else's version of your life. You begin to see layers upon layers of borrowed beliefs, inherited fears and automatic responses that have been operating like background software. making choices that aren't really choices, pursuing goals that aren't really yours. The ordeal that every hero faces is the ego's death throes, as you discover you're not who you thought you were. You're not your job title or your relationship status, not your achievements or your failures, not your thoughts or your emotions, or even your personal history. This dissolution feels terrifying because the ego equates it with annihilation, but it's actually liberation from a prison cell you didn't know you'd been living in for decades. What emerges from this ordeal isn't a perfect person or an enlightened being, but something far more valuable: presence itself. The capacity to be fully alive in each moment, instead of ghost-walking through your days. The ability to respond to life freshly instead of reactively. The freedom to love without attachment and engage without losing yourself in the drama. But the real test comes when you try to bring this treasure back to the ordinary world, when you attempt to live from this deeper place while surrounded by people who are still asleep. This is where many heroes get lost, either by trying to force others to wake up, which never works and only creates resistance, or by gradually falling back asleep themselves, because maintaining consciousness requires constant vigilance in an unconscious world. The rare gift of authentic connection happens when you encounter someone else who's made this journey, someone who's faced their own shadows and emerged with their own hard-won wisdom. These meetings are precious beyond description because they remind you that presence recognizes presence, that depth calls to depth, that you're not the only one who's discovered there's more to existence than the mechanical repetition of unconscious patterns. When two conscious beings recognize each other, there's an immediate understanding that transcends words. You can have conversations that actually matter, silences that feel full instead of awkward, connections based on who you really are instead of who you pretend to be. These encounters are rare because authentic presence itself is rare. Most people are so invested in their performance that they can't afford to be real, so committed to their image that they can't risk vulnerability. But when these meetings do occur, they're like finding water in a desert, like discovering you're not the only one who speaks your native language in a foreign country. There's a recognition, a remembering, a coming home to something you'd forgotten was possible between human beings. This is why Campbell's journey ultimately leads to love, not the conditional love that depends on others being who we want them to be, but the unconditional love that arises from understanding we're all struggling with the same fundamental challenge: how to be human, how to be awake, how to be authentic in a world that often rewards the opposite. The loneliness of the awakening process transforms into something Campbell called sacred solitude, the capacity to be complete within yourself while remaining open to genuine connection with others. You no longer need others to complete you, or validate you, or entertain you, which paradoxically makes you more available for real relationship when it presents itself. The path of consciousness isn't about becoming special or superior, it's about becoming more human, more real, more capable of the kind of presence that the world desperately needs. It's about developing the courage to be yourself when no one understands, the strength to maintain your truth when it's lonely, the wisdom to love others without trying to change them. If these words are resonating with something deep inside you, if you recognize the journey we're describing, if you've felt both the terror and liberation of waking up, then welcome home. You've found your tribe, fellow travelers, who understand that the most important adventure happens not in the external world, but in the depths of your own consciousness. Share your story in the comments. Your journey matters, your voice counts, and your presence contributes to the awakening of human consciousness itself. The return that Campbell wrote about isn't a physical homecoming, but a psychological integration, the challenging art of living in the world without being consumed by its unconsciousness. You discover that the treasure you've brought back from the depths of your own being isn't meant to be hoarded in solitary contemplation, but shared through the simple act of being genuinely present in a world that has forgotten what presence looks like. This is the mastery Campbell called becoming Lord of Two Worlds, the ability to function effectively in the mechanical realm while remaining rooted in consciousness, to engage with the theater of ordinary life while never forgetting it's a performance. You learn to speak the language of the sleepwalkers without falling asleep yourself, to participate in their games without losing your center, to love them without needing them to change or wake up or see the world through your eyes. The freedom that emerges from this integration isn't freedom from responsibility, but freedom within it. You're no longer driven by the compulsive need to prove yourself worthy of love, to achieve recognition that will finally make you feel valuable, to accumulate enough security to quiet the anxiety that comes from believing you're separate and alone in a hostile universe. You can work without being identified with your work, succeed without being inflated by success, fail without being devastated by failure. The ups and downs of ordinary existence become weather patterns you observe, rather than storms that destroy your equilibrium. This doesn't mean you become indifferent or detached in a cold way. Instead, you develop what Campbell recognized as the capacity for engaged non-attachment, the ability to care deeply without being controlled by outcomes. The solitude that once felt like exile becomes a source of renewable strength. You realize that being alone with yourself isn't punishment, but privilege, that the capacity to enjoy your own company is the foundation of all genuine relationships. When you no longer need others to complete you or validate you or rescue you from your own emptiness, you can offer your presence instead of your neediness, your fullness instead of your hunger for what others can provide. The mechanical world continues around you, people still lost in their unconscious patterns, still playing their roles in the great theater of Maya, still mistaking their performance for their identity. But now you move among them like a lucid dreamer, aware that you're in a dream but no longer trapped by it. You can participate without being hypnotized, play the game without forgetting it's a game, engage with the drama without losing yourself in it. This is what Campbell meant by the freedom to live. Liberation from the compulsive patterns that once drove your existence, the capacity to respond to life spontaneously rather than mechanically, the ability to be present for whatever arises without being overwhelmed or diminished by it. You're no longer the victim of your circumstances or the prisoner of your conditioning. You're awake, conscious, free to choose your response to whatever life presents. The journey never truly ends because consciousness isn't a destination, but a way of traveling. There are always deeper layers to explore, subtler forms of unconsciousness to recognize and release, more refined ways of being present and authentic. But you're no longer seeking something outside yourself to make you complete. You've found the treasure Campbell wrote about in every myth, the recognition that what you were seeking was seeking you, that who you really are was never lost, only temporarily forgotten beneath layers of conditioning and compromise. The danger Campbell warned about isn't in making this journey, but in refusing the call when it comes, in settling for the mechanical life when consciousness is beckoning. The real tragedy isn't death but unconsciousness, not failure, but never attempting to discover who you really are beneath all the expectations and inherited dreams. The world needs heroes, not in the external sense of people who save others, but in the deepest mythic sense that Campbell understood. People who've made the journey into their own depths and returned with the capacity to live authentically, to love unconditionally, to be present in a world that desperately needs presence. You are that hero. The call you've been hearing, the restlessness you've been feeling, the sense that there's something more, that's your own heroic journey beginning. The adventure Campbell mapped across cultures and centuries isn't happening to someone else. It's happening to you right now. In this moment where you recognize yourself in these words and remember who you really are beneath who you've been pretending to be. The universe itself awakens through your awakening, remembers itself through your remembering, discovers itself through your journey into consciousness. You're not just taking the hero's journey, you are the hero's journey, the eternal story of spirit recognizing itself in human form, the myth that never ends, because it's the very structure of existence itself.